levied against any government, and particularly a government such as ours, and the US government south of the border here, that purports to uphold the rule of law, that lectures other countries on human rights, that passes itself off as the moral conscience for the Western world, and to have been complicit in something that is real, something that is horrifying against one of its citizens, the torture of a Canadian youth. Even former General and now Senator Romeo Dallaire, in his recent book on child soldiers, describes the stance of the Canadian government with regards to Omar Khadr as a black mark on Canada's international reputation and standing in the fight for child's rights and human rights as a whole. Instead, our government, by its actions, in my view, has demonstrated a shocking, reckless, and ruthless disregard for those moral and legal laws that gives effect to the very essence, the very idea of what is fair. And by behaving in that way towards a Canadian citizen, it has shown how fragile are the laws and their application that each and every one of us assume protects us when we are faced with a government determined to follow a contrary path. We live in a generation that has the most sophisticated development of international laws, international treaties, and conventions the international community has ever known, all stating that human rights abuses will not be tolerated. And those international instruments, they include the Geneva Convention, the Convention on Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Convention on the Rights of the Child, by the way, is probably the most signed-on treaty in international law. Almost every country in the world has signed on to that treaty, the protection of children, except two: the failed state of Somalia and the United States. And all those instruments are applicable to, say, Omar Khadr, for example, and other detainees in Guantanamo Bay. And all and each every one of them, one of those instruments, one of those treaties, are all denied to them. And without a cry, without an objection by the Canadian government, unlike each and every Western country who complained about Guantanamo Bay, what it stands for, and having its own nationals or citizens there, we Canadians, we remain quiet. And as a signatory to all those international treaties, we are legally obligated to protest where they are not being applied to one of his own citizens. And yet, our country, our government, have continued to pick and choose when to uphold its obligations under international law. For example, it wasn't so long ago that the Canadian government interceded with the Mexican government to release Brenda Martin, who was found guilty of fraud by a properly constituted Mexican court, unlike what Guantanamo Bay stands for. And even sent a private jet to bring that poor lady back to Canada. Whereas the Canadian government sold Maharara out to the Americans and then the Syrians who tortured him. And the Canadian government was complicit in the arrest of Mr. Abdul Zarek from Quebec in Sudan, where he was tortured and eventually released by Sudanese authorities, where he took up residence after that in the Canadian embassy for many months, while Canada refused to bring him home until the Federal Court of Canada intervened. And once he was cleared of any relationship to terrorist activities, the Canadian government continued its sociopathic behaviour in making his life miserable. These are Canadian citizens. But unlike Brendan Martin, Mr. Abdul Tariq, Mr. Omar, and Mr. Khadr were Muslims, not good white Anglo-Saxons like most of us. And you know, I'm digressing now. Torture has become sort of a mainstay, an everyday word these days. You see it on TV, you see people being tortured for the greater good, and I'll address that better as we move on. But I'd like to tell you about what's not torture in Guantanamo Bay. 6 years ago in Guantanamo Bay, there was a hunger strike. There have been many hunger strikes. But in this particular hunger strike, and it's the only protest, it's the only ability that a detainee in Guantanamo had is to not eat. And so 32 Muslim detainees were singled out and locked away in Guantanamo Bay. In Guantanamo Bay, as many of you have seen, you've seen the cages. But we never talk about the secret prisons. There are 3 secret prisons in Guantanamo Bay. Camp 2, Camp 3, and Camp 7. You're not allowed to mention 7 in Guantanamo Bay. And so this Brigadier General, who's a psychiatrist, approached me one time because I've been going to Guantanamo many times, and he said, "Have you been to Unit C in Camp 3? And I said, "Yeah, many times." And he said, "We're looking at the files of the hunger strikers." He said, "You know, there's 32 cells in Unit C, but these guys were locked away, and they have been force-fed for year after year after year after year in Guantanamo Bay. And they're force-fed because outside each and every cell is a feeding tube. And 3 times a day, those hunger strikers are taken out of these cells, tied to the chair by the throat, by the waist, and by the feet, and force-fed with half-inch tube down the nose with liquid food. And nobody ever asked those hunger strikers, "You still want to be on a hunger strike?" Assuming you were. And over the years, many of those hunger strikers have been damaged and are in hospital in this particular unit. In fact, I was in Guantanamo in July, and I was there to meet a particular hunger striker as well as Omar Khadr. And I asked, and I couldn't get to see the chap I wanted to see. And then I was told that in extracting him from the cell, just so happened his back got broken. No big deal, no publicity, no more information to be given. But that's not torture. That is those procedures have been put in place as the Pentagon will tell you to protect those hunger strikers. We're keeping them alive for their own good. And that's not torture. So just think about being fed 3 times a day with the hose going down your nose, feeding you. So if that's not torture, what do you think is torture? Because we give that word such little thought. Commemorating the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers, interspersed amidst expressions of sorrow for the victims and their families, was the familiar self-congratulatory praise for the military's pursuit of the attackers, the performance of first responders, and of course the good work of our troops abroad. Flags and martial music cheered moments of respectful silence alongside expressions of rage and ferocity. And talking about pathos, President Obama and former President George Bush stood side by side at ground zero as a silver bell rang twice to commemorate the exact moment when each of those two jetliners struck the towers. Mr. Bush at that time then invoked Abraham Lincoln, quoting his letter to a widow whose 5 sons had died during the American Civil War. And of course, President Obama, he declared these 10 years tell a story of resilience. And at the end of the day, it will be said we kept the faith. We took a painful blow and we emerged stronger as a country. Yet, in New York, where families of victims gathered once again in an effort to come to grips with their collective trauma, something I would suggest to you had changed. Some had begun to question the point of continuing to commemorate something that can never be forgotten. Some relatives spoke of their exhaustion with the September ritual of turning private grief into public remembrance, and of simply wanting just to get on with their lives. A mother who had lost her son that day on 9/11 said that dwelling on the past doesn't serve any purpose. We have grieved enough in these last 10 years. Let us live now. And while some have spoken of the need to move on, the sum effect of the media roundy clock showcasing of the 9/11 tragedy was not a willingness to move on, not a willingness to change, but rather a validation of that siege mentality that we live in today. The story that began in New York on September 11, 2001 remains dreadfully unsatisfying 10 years later. It is a far more complicated narrative than the simple good versus evil story. The remembrance services touched upon a lot of questions, but there was no sustained focus on the vital one, I would respectfully say. And it is, how long are we all going to be held hostage for what happened that day? As the 9/11 mother said, we have grieved enough for these last 10 years. Let us live now. Historically, terrorism has always been with us. There will always be terror threats. But this so-called war on terror is unlike any other because it's never ending. Our leaders pick and choose whom we call terrorists based upon their own trade and foreign policy interests. I thought Omar Khadr was a friend of ours till recently. But Osama bin Laden, he was a great guy helping us with the Russians in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden he became the evil people. Terrible. Secret codes being created to hear secret evidence. I go to secret codes. I go to Ottawa to a secret code. I don't get to see the evidence. I have to argue in a vacuum while the prosecution or representatives for the Canadian government argue what all this means to the judge, and then I've got to go in and try and figure out, read minds. Secret codes. Guilt inferred by association. My God, there's one. You're a Muslim, you're guilty. And then torture and rendition legally justified. Well, we just have big powers because we're talking about using information derived from torture. I have dealt with that. I was in Islamabad. I did a case. And what I was doing was I was trying to find out where there was a secret prison in Islamabad run by the US for the Canadian court. And in that, and what I was able to demonstrate to the court was that there is a prison run by the ISI, which is not a very nice organization of Pakistani intelligence. They have this prison in I forget what sector of Islamabad, and there are 12 cells in a basement. One of those cells is a torture cell, and the other are full of people waiting to be tortured. And Canada sends their representatives there. America sends their representatives there. And I showed all that on behalf of my client. They don't torture, at least not in that person. At least not my client, Canada or the United States. But you know, they wait for my client to come out having been tortured for 7 days. He was there for 14 months in this subterranean basement. And they tried to use that evidence to extradite him from Canada once he got kicked out of Pakistan to go to the United States. And our courts overruled it. So much has been lost. So much has been avoided. So much has been ignored in the war on terror. We appear to have forgotten the lessons of the Start Chain, where the accused were subjected to torture, to accusations based on secret evidence, held by a secret court, or being shackled and in extremes of isolation. So I haven't completely lost the plot when I compare what goes on today and what took place and what changes that took place from the 17th century. And I'm mindful of that phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The worst successes of the last 10 years should have sounded alarms. Alarms to your churches. Alarms to your law institutions. Alarms to everybody. And not the least because of that precise historic parallel to the Star Chamber in the 17th century. To many, the war on terror has come to be viewed as an extension of Islamophobia, where Muslims are viewed as the suspect community whereby their rights are denied and the rule of law ignored. Confusion, anxiety, misinformation has caused inappropriate and discriminatory action by private citizens towards Arabs, Muslims, South Asians and Sikhs, cultures perceived by intelligence agencies to pose a threat to our society. It has been, in my view, a decade of dueling stupidities. Bin Laden from caves and compounds, spouting his bloody nonsense. Religious leaders like Pat Robinson declaring that Islam is not even a religion, but a violent political system. And Western politicians, media and intellectuals have been crazy, slotting events into a juicy clash of civilization's epic story. Since September the 11th, race, ethnicity and religion have also become proxies for suspected terrorist activity, which in turn has become a pretext for the application of Canadian immigration laws in an unequal manner towards Arabs, South Asians and Muslims. Conduct that would not have been tolerated prior to 9/11. For example, we now talk about refugees as queue jumpers and potential terrorists. A particularly disturbing form of terrorism profiling has been the US federal government's use of race as a basis for detention without due process, and its subsequent use of the anti-terrorism investigation as a vehicle for the disproportionate application of US immigration laws against detainees who are found to be innocent of any terrorist activity. In the wake of September 11, and I worked with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in those early years, where the United States detained hundreds, if not thousands, of Arabs, South Asians and Muslims on suspicion of terrorist activities. There were 4 basketball players in Florida who the car broke down, and this woman saw them and called the FBI, and they had helicopters and stuff. Those guys were locked away for a year. We spoke to people who had been locked away from you and suddenly released, but not released outside the prison they were, had been detained, but in another state. And we talked to them about trying to persuade them to come together as a collective and we'll start a lawsuit. We've gone forever, but at least we started last week. They wanted nothing. Quite properly, what they wanted to do is just get on with their life and keep their heads down. You know, close to my house is a Starbucks, and I have these neighbours with more degrees than you can speak. And they're wealthy. I live in this posh area. And the day that I announced to the press that when Omar Khadr comes out, I'm going to get him an education in this Christian college in Edney. And when I was asked where he could stay, I said, I don't care if he could stay in my house. Well, King's College had to call the police because there were so many threats that day to the various professors. And my friends, my good, well-known friends of the same culture as myself, they couldn't believe I would have a Muslim in this neighbourhood. There was no knowledge of international humanitarian conventions was needed by anybody. No legal training, no education was needed to understand what we were witnessing was unlawful. This was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions at work, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was far worse, far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of the law, and it was intended to be so. And in that world, crimes against humanity were to be carried out in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and were carried out, and continue to be carried out in places like Bagram in Afghanistan. And yet we remain silent. And while these tragic human beings, I can tell you, I remember, I don't know when it was, a couple of years ago, when I used to go to Guantanamo, I used to leave there and I'd fly back into Florida, I'd be in my hotel room and I'd feel weak. You know, big tough Scot here, but no big tears, they're weeping. And then over the years, you know, I just became more cynical. Nice to friends me. And then I remember one day going through the security I go through, and I'm going to Camp 3, and on the way to Camp 3, which is the secret area, I'm at this cage. And in this cage there was about maybe 20 little cubicles. You never see any. We never see anything. They're not out walking. I hear Israel Levant wrote a book, and he talks about how they're being mollycoddled in Guantanamo. Well, I'd like them to join me and come to Guantanamo. But I remember hearing someone pray, and I thought it was a prayer, and it was chilling. I had no idea what he said, but what he was saying, I thought he was saying, he was screaming to his God, he was crying to his God. And it was the tone, the depth of pain in that voice, the depth of just abject plea. I assumed he was crying to his God, saying, get me out of here. And so, I'm not just saying that. These human beings, these are tragic human beings, shut away under incessant, better conditions, but originally in the early years, incessant inhuman conditions, and still being charged without any offence. And they have no opportunity to see the evidence. They're held in indefinite detention without being seen or charged or having a trial. And all the years I've gone to Guantanamo Bay, I have never seen Omar Khadr walk. He's always been chained to a damn floor. Only time I see him walk is when he was frog marched while he was shackled into the courtroom. He sits on this chair, shackled, and I never get to speak to him privately. There's no solicitor-client privilege. I'm surrounded by everybody in the world, including cameras, soldiers. They're not allowed to be seen or heard. They're not permitted access to the media. Obviously, I'm holding their attention. They're not allowed visits from human organizations, or any consular visits, or by family and friends. Why is that? As a criminal lawyer, I tell you, when the prosecution have the evidence, they don't hesitate to put you up on that stand and face you punishment. But here in Guantanamo, all you know is what you've been told by propaganda, that these are the worst of the worst. And so in the American mind as well as the Canadian mind, what do you get? You get the opportunity to allow your fantasies, your imaginations, thinking these are the worst of the worst. And while they're there, I'm safe at home in my little community. And yet, and they long, I can tell you, they long for their voices to be heard, for someone to speak out on their behalf. Not just guys like me. And yet, he remains silent. Because you know what? It's not cool to talk about terrorism. Because they become a terrorist. I've been accused of being a terrorist on a radio show. It's uncool to stand up. And we're 10 years on since 9/11. And I've demonstrated to you, perhaps naively, the historical context. So as I conclude, why have I continued to persist with such foolhardy Scottish stubbornness? And what have I learned from this experience that I can leave it to you and share with you? Well, first of all, I'm a lawyer. And that means I believe in law and justice. And I'm taught that democracies and their laws are spent the best possible opportunity for justice. And that we all, I sound naive, we all have a duty to make sure we do everything possible to make the world safer, regardless of colour, race or creed. But more importantly, when we cave in to fear and apathy, when we fear to speak out in opposition because it's uncool, there are no longer then boundaries to state action. They can do anything they want. And impermissible behaviour. And if we walk away from our duty to uphold human values, that's all I talk about. It's not like I'm some crazy guy who's got some abstract notion. I talk about fundamental rights and nothing else. And when we don't uphold our duty to uphold human values, who will speak for us? And I'll tell you. So, thank you. Embedded in my talk this evening has been the responsibility of each and one of you, the imperative of each and every one of you, to stand against injustice. Our responsibility as human beings is to speak out to the reality of inhumanity, and to speak out against the moral hollowness of political inaction. Because the only crime, in my view, equal to willful inhumanity is the crime of indifference, the crime of silence, and the crime of forgetting. Thank you.